Okay, welcome everybody. Today we are here with Sharon. We're going to be talking about grasshopper and Mormon cricket management in the West, and we're really grateful to have Sharon with us. She's a pesticide reduction specialist with the Xerces Society, a conservation organization working to protect the natural world through the conservation of invertebrates. So Sharon leads Xerces' work in seeking sustainable solutions for grasshopper and Mormon cricket management, especially on public lands. She spent 27 years with U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and U.S. Forest Service, working as a wildlife biologist, conservation planner, and refuge manager. And she received her MS in Energy and Resources and a BA in Biology from the University of California. So we're really grateful to have her expertise and her knowledge. And we will be recording this and sharing this on our Pollinator Stewardship Council YouTube channel. And we are just really excited to hear about this and learn more. And we'll make sure to share this out with some beekeeping organizations as well. Again, grateful to have you, Sharon, and go ahead and feel free to move forward with the presentation. Thank you so much.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Jennifer, and everybody here. I've been studying this program for a few years now, but this is the first time I've actually talked to a group of beekeepers about it. I mean, I've talked to Steve a little bit, and there's probably been beekeepers maybe occasionally on one of the many presentations I've given. But anyway, so I'm really excited to have this opportunity to talk to you here today because I think there's a lot here that's really relevant for you. So anyway, look about Xerces, just those of you who may not know us, we are really like the Audubon Society for insects. And so our pollinator program is really focused on putting habitat in, especially on farms and working lands, ranches, but also in cities. And then our endangered species program really monitors the status, especially of declining invertebrates. A lot of different bumblebees, fireflies, different butterflies, etc. And then the pesticide team, which is our smallest team, but very passionate people. We are focused on basically reducing the risk of pesticides to invertebrates. And I know that that's what your organization is focused on too. So today I'm going to focus on, what is the grasshopper suppression program, especially the federal program, but that's not where it ends. So I'll talk a little bit about that. And then I'll talk a little bit about what does this mean for bees? And I really want to take a holistic perspective here because we hear a lot that grasshoppers, when they're at high densities, eat up forage and compete not only with cattle for forage, but also with bees for forage. And I want your perspective on that. And then I'll talk a little bit about some of the reforms that we've been pursuing and how you can help easily, hopefully, and then present a little bit on some other rangeland resources that might be of interest to you. And then I want to wrap it up with some open discussion. So let's start out just thinking about where we came from, because when settlers started to move across the West, they started to encounter in the Western states, they weren't states at that point, but in the West, high densities of grasshoppers that occasionally really threaten their crops. The Mormons have quite a history of this, written history about their experiences, which is one reason why one of the pest orthopteran species called the Mormon cricket has that name. But in particular, they struggled with a species called the Rocky Mountain locust. And this book here, this book cover called Locust, written by Jeff Lockwood, is an absolutely fascinating. It reads almost like a thriller, but it's really a history of what this insect meant to America when people started to move west and how this young country sort of dealt with it. And you'll also find out, if you don't already know, that this particular locust, which really is responsible for sort of the worst of the outbreaks that we have ever seen in our history, is now extinct. It doesn't even exist anymore. And it's a strange story. But I really, if you're looking for an interesting read and you like nonfiction that reads like a thriller, I highly recommend it. But anyway, what happened in the 1800s when the pioneers were settling the West really shaped not only our attitudes towards grasshoppers, but also the institutions that evolved from that. So, um, one thing to know, just looking at basic biology, is that the outbreaks from grasshoppers and Mormon crickets are really episodic. So I have a map of what the survey showed last year in Colorado. The red points are where grasshopper populations exceeded 8 per square yard, and that is what APHIS considers an economic threshold. This map doesn't show Mormon crickets here, but for Mormon crickets, they consider 1 cricket per square yard above a threshold, which is, immediate action essentially, which is kind of interesting. But when you look at sort of this time series over here, and it's not necessarily like lined up in the best way, but basically kind of going from here to here to here, here to here to here to here to here. But you can see that the purple areas, which represent where the outbreaks were in Montana, move around the map. And in some periods, they're big, in some periods, they're small. So this is an insect that rises and falls over time. It's cyclical. There's a lot of, explanations for why that is. Nobody has really figured out like a absolute, you know, um, um, airtight model for why, but a lot of people talk about climate. There are other factors at play, including pathogens, natural enemies, and so on. And some areas are more prone than others over the periods of years. Like when you look at this map, it shows you that in Wyoming, when you look over 33 years, the black areas were the ones that most frequently had high grasshopper outbreaks. Now, I'm assuming that this data was collected in such a way that it wasn't, that the surveying itself wasn't, just surveying the high propensity areas. Sometimes you can get surveys that look like that and you sort of reinforce what you think you already know. But it's been a while since I read this paper, so I don't actually remember. But anyway, the point being that some areas tend to be more prone than others. But anyway, going back into the history, I probably should have put this a little bit earlier. As people settling in the West, trying to farm, were dealing with grasshoppers and crickets. Eventually, the federal government stepped in and started to take a role. And so the U.S. Department of Agriculture, under the Animal and Plant Health Inspection Service, they're the ones who oversee this program. And the program operates in 17 Western states. So essentially, once you pass, I think that's the 95th meridian, right? There could be grasshopper suppression efforts in any of these states. And you all know this country probably better than anybody, driving your bees around all the time. But we have like a mix of both public and private rangeland, with the private rangeland showing in brown and the public showing in green. So looking more closely at basically the data that was available from looking at contract solicitations on the APHIS website, um, since 2008, essentially, I was able to take these maps because APHIS wouldn't give them to me, but I found them on the contracting solicitation website and basically map out where APHIS was actually issuing contract solicitations for sprays. Now, when they issue a contract solicitation, it's a pretty good estimate of where they want to spray, but the spray area actually can be bigger or it can be smaller. And because APHIS doesn't share those maps, this is the best I got. I don't know if it was actually more land than this or less. I mean, and these were aerial sprays, but essentially you see there's a big concentration here in Montana and Wyoming, also in Southeast Oregon, into Nevada, and then portions of southern Idaho. You see a little bit in Utah, a little bit up here in western Montana. Now, these are the aerial sprays. There can be sometimes ground treatments. Those tend to happen with Mormon crickets more often than grasshoppers. And usually they're spraying like a 10,000 acre area at minimum when they're using aerial spray because of the cost of mobilizing the planes and all of that. They're using, and I'll talk about the chemicals in a few minutes. Now, when APHIS did its most recent environmental impact statement in 2019. They presented data back to 2002, I think, and basically presented like this is how many acres we treated per year. Now the average spray footprint based upon that, like approximately like 18-year period, was about 500,000 acres per year, but it can range into the millions. In 2021 in Montana, APHIS was advertising 2.6 million acres in just that 1 year. They did end up spraying a little less than that, I was able to find out. It was such a bad drought year that my hypothesis, that you can't really confirm this, but is that the drought itself affected the forage to the point that it wasn't really worthwhile to spray. But anyway, that gives you an idea of sort of like the scale of the program. Now, I do want to say that this map, it's going to be harder for me to know what happens in the future because we did bring a lawsuit against APHIS in 2022. APHIS is very averse to sharing information generally with the public, but probably more particularly with us nowadays. And they've taken steps to do their contracting differently so that it's not as easy to download maps from the sam.gov site. So I don't know that in the future I will have access to geographically specific data like this. However, for the first time, I was able to attend the National Grasshopper Management Board meeting, which occurs over like 2 days in February every year. And we did get a staff person appointed to that. So hopefully there'll be some more transparency and ability to access information. And as I shared with Steve earlier this year, from attending that meeting, I found out a little bit more about some private sprays that occurred in South Dakota. But this is just to illustrate a larger point, which is that the federal effort, which is run through APHIS, is not the only way that large areas can be sprayed. States can also organize sprays, local governments, especially county weed and pest control districts, and even private actors. So in South Dakota, these maps show that in 2024, there were more than 1 million acres sprayed, and it was a privately organized spray. He basically set up meetings of local landowners. They jumped on it, and APHIS didn't do anything, but I guess they found out about it, provided some technical assistance. And then it was sort of repeated, but in a different county, I think Meade County here in South Dakota, where they sprayed over 645,000 acres in 2023. Do I have those numbers mixed up? Oh yeah, just got my two maps. It started out in Meade and then it went to a much larger area in 2024. A couple other examples in Wyoming. I don't have maps, but you can see where these red circles are, that this is where sprays were being organized, I believe through counties in Wyoming. I don't know how many acres. And then in Oregon ran a reimbursement program in 2022 that basically told landowners, if you need to spray or want to spray, then we will reimburse you. And I was able to get those records through a public records request and map that out. So the sizes of the circles here show the number of acres that was sprayed. So you can see a real concentration like in Harney and Umatilla County, which isn't a surprise because this is often where APHIS also sprays. Also over here near like Klamath Lake and kind of like the south central part of Oregon. I should say that the map is showing the address that was on the record for the landowner, which isn't necessarily where the land was sprayed. So I don't think they sprayed anything in Portland, for instance, but that was the landowner's address. It was more likely out here. So there's a few kind of outliers like that just to be aware of. Just looking at, okay, what are they spraying and what do we know about how those affect bees in particular? They have 4 ingredients in the program that they've authorized, and malathion is one of them, but I'm not going to talk about it because it's very rarely used anymore. It used to be very commonly used, but they've since moved on. So diflubenzuron is an insect growth regulator. You guys probably know a lot about these because they've gotten a lot of talk, in the almonds. And some of you have participated in a study related to that. So, but basically, it works on eggs and larvae, or the juvenile stages of an insect. It's fairly persistent. It sticks to terrestrial vegetation for weeks when it's early sprayed. It's also can be taken up through ingestion, or is taken up generally through ingestion, but and the ingested diflubenzuron can accumulate in the ovaries of egg-laying females. This has been demonstrated in the lab. I use that term egg-laying females because of the way that they can create these sort of microcolonies with bumblebees. And so these are like, anyway, I get a little confused because I'm not an entomologist, but egg-laying females, that the way in which these microcolonies sort of like, it's not like a queen actually, but they become egg-laying females. Maybe one of you can explain it to me better later, but anyway, and also the topical, like basically if they get sprayed and the exoskeleton gets diflubenzuron, and it can also be absorbed through the cuticle. Carbaryl, you're probably pretty familiar with. It's a neurotoxic chemical. It's considered highly toxic to honeybees and many other insects, old chemistry. Now, in the program currently, it is applied mostly as a bait. They occasionally use it as an aerial spray, but not often. And as a bait, while there are basically, there's still some exposure possibility for bees. It's much, much less than an aerial liquid spray would be. So you probably don't need to worry about that one too much. Then chlorantraniliprole, which is a diamide, one of these newer chemistries. This is a very persistent chemical, up to 3 years for the residues to be cut in half. So and it's also known to be really, really effective at killing butterflies and moth caterpillars. And it's considered for adult bees, non-toxic using the EPA's sort of like classification. But it's also been shown in studies to suppress bumblebee reproduction. So it may be more working almost like an insect growth regulator, more effective on the larval stages. Now, this is an authorized chemical, but from the records that I have, which again, there's holes in the data because APHIS has not been transparent, but they have not started using this chemical yet, and that may change at any time because it is authorized. I want to say that this is what APHIS uses, but as I mentioned previously, states, private actors, counties, they all can organize sprays too, either large ones or individually on their own properties. And they have a much broader suite of chemicals available to them, which I've listed some of them here. These are examples. There's actually quite a longer list, but one thing I did want to highlight, and Steve, we talked about this earlier this year, but that imidacloprid, which is a neonic, it can be applied as a seed treatment. It's labeled as a seed treatment for use against grasshoppers. There are also foliar neonic products that can be used against grasshoppers for certain crops. So potato, soybean, peanut, and other dried and succulent beans and peas. Now, we have a lot of potatoes in Idaho. I don't think we have any soybean in the West. I could be wrong. Peanuts again, no. But dried and succulent beans and peas are pretty common in parts of Montana. So it's possible that these are being used in those areas where they're growing, garbanzo beans and lentils and all those things. And then there's biologically based products. So there's a broad list. Because, private land spraying, it's really hard to know what's being administered and all. I don't have a whole lot of information about, how frequently these are used as opposed to diflubenzuron or carbaryl. So one of the things I wanted to do, because this is such a great opportunity for me to talk to beekeepers, is find out, how do grasshoppers affect you bees, and how do grasshopper treatments affect you bees? Because what I hear from APHIS is that grasshoppers eat up forage, including flowers for bees, because they'll sometimes clip the plant, or some grasshoppers will preferentially eat flowers. And so one of the justifications that they often give um, even though the program was really designed to protect forage for cattle, is that they've increasingly begun to use the justification that they're also protecting habitat. And I'm curious about what your experience is about this. And so we'll have some time at the end to discuss this a little bit more. But I've included a QR code to a survey here. Steve and Jennifer approved to be, basically sharing this with you or asking for this. And I would really appreciate just, it's anonymous. You don't have to divulge your name and you don't have to answer all the questions. All the questions are voluntary, but it's essentially a way in which I might be able to help understand a little bit better what's your experience with grasshopper outbreaks when they're untreated. If you have had your bees in an area where grasshoppers have been high and they've been untreated, and what about in an area that receives a treatment? And I'm asking about your bee, the kind of like the response for your colonies, as well as things like notification. So I'm going to continue on. So when we look at pesticide risks for pollinators, we think about a few things, and especially when they kind of overlap. So first of all, is the use widespread, or does the pesticide move off site easily? In other words, is there a lot of land that's affected? And in this case, we do have a lot of land that's affected. Now, this is not every year that all this area is being sprayed, but sometimes those areas are really huge. And so for honeybees, you might be able to move them out of the way. For native bees, there might not be any way that they could actually escape a really widespread spray. And then likelihood of exposure, like when does the spray occur? Are the bees out? Like, is it, obviously like a daytime spray, which these are. The season, does it overlap with their activity when they're out there foraging? And in this case, yes, we do have concerns about bees because of all that. Is there high toxicity? Well, diflubenzuron is certainly not as toxic using the normal metrics as some of the older chemicals that they used to use. They used to use, DDT-like compounds in this program for years. They don't use those anymore. They're not using things like malathion and carbaryl spray very much. I mean, hardly at all. But although they're still part of the program, they're on the list. In other words, they could, but they don't. So toxicity is a question, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later because there's differing science about that. And then persistence. Is this a chemical, or are these chemicals that are going to last for a long time? Because then the exposure likelihood is higher because, it's just going to stick around as bees progress through their life cycle. You're going to have new bees that hatch out and are exposed to this, even if the spray occurred 2 weeks ago sometimes. So these are red flags that we would use really for any kind of pesticide application. It's kind of just a quick sort of like rubric, I guess you could call it, in our heads to sort of say, well, do we have kind of a risky situation here? So let's go look at diflubenzuron a little bit more closely because this is the most used insecticide against grasshoppers. So as I mentioned before, diflubenzuron can be absorbed through the cuticle, at least for bumblebees. And when diflubenzuron, basically when the spray hits the flowers and the bees come along and collect the pollen and nectar and bring it back to the nest, that's going to be ingested by larvae as well as the adult bees. And the way it acts is that it kills the larvae by preventing molting. But if it's ingested by adults, again, like the queens or the egg-laying bumblebee females, it actually accumulates in the ovaries and it suppresses the reproductive output for bumblebees. Does that happen for honeybees? I'm not sure, but it's something I think, to consider that is an issue for related bee species. What I hear from aphids is that they're not worried about the insecticides actually hurting bees because they say they use below label rates, and I put that in quotes. In fact, the rates that they use are exactly what's on the label. It's not actually below label rate. What it is it's below the label rate for many other crops that are out there. Like the label rate for almonds is higher, the label rate for a bunch of other crops is higher. So they are using a low rate relative to these other crops that are out there. However, these are often natural systems that are getting sprayed. These are public lands, BLM lands, private rangelands that have never been plowed. And so we've got essentially habitat out there that might be pretty good habitat for a lot of different insects, bees included. And so this is, still a concern. So what I want to do is focus a little bit on this residue study that the USDA Ag Research Service undertook last year in 2024. They measured the residues in the flowers. They didn't actually just collect pollen or try to collect nectar. They took floral samples and they ground them up, which is a kind of a common, little bit easier way of measuring residues in flowers. And they measured at 2 time points, 24 hours after a spray and 2 weeks after a spray. And this was a real live spray that they did in eastern Montana. And when they do their spraying, they skip every other swath. This is the what they call the RATS method, and they have the planes fly a swath, and the plane is, the wingspan is this wide, and then they skip a swath that would be equivalent to the wingspan, and then they spray another swath. So they took flowers from both these sprayed and unsprayed swaths. Well, of course, there's going to be some drift into the unsprayed swaths because this is an aerial spray. So anyway, what they found was that the average diflubenzuron residue 24 hours after the spray was 360 parts per billion, and 14 days was about a little bit less than half of that. Excuse me, more than half. No, I think I have my math wrong there. 159, a little less than half of the initial. So it declined by about half or so after 14 days. But these concentrations were still higher than those that have been found in studies to basically cause failure of reproduction in bumblebees to fall by 50% in 2 lab studies. But now they were fed continuously, and I'll show a little bit more about those studies. So basically, these red lines here, the red and the orange line, this is what they found. This is not a time sequence, but this is just showing you that's the concentration they found 24 hours after the spray. This is the concentration they found 2 weeks after the spray. What Momart's found in pollen when feeding pollen, diflubenzuron contaminated pollen to bumblebees for 11 weeks, is that it took this much to cause a halving to cause reproductive output to fall by half. So in this study, clearly it was, if we only had this study, it would seem like we don't have a problem here because there wasn't that much residue left. But then we have another study, or the same study, that looked at sucrose for 11 weeks. And in fact, the level was sort of in between these two. So as this is sort of declining, over a period of 2 weeks, well, maybe we wouldn't get 50%, cut in reproductive output, but certainly there might be a cause for concern. And then there was another study that basically looked at a shorter exposure, 6 weeks exposure, again, a sucrose mixture with the diflubenzuron. It took very, very little diflubenzuron for only 6 weeks to actually cause reproductive output to fall by half, and clearly below. This was like, I don't know, 37 parts per billion. I can't quite remember the number, but clearly below what they were measuring 2 weeks later. So even though this was a longer exposure period in the lab, it seems like we've got a concern because we have, science that's showing us that even at very low levels, you might actually have a pretty significant impact on reproduction of bumblebees. So this is an issue that I've been bringing up in my comment letters, and APHIS is like, no problem. So what about honeybees and diflubenzuron? So I'm just going to present these 4 studies here and some of the results. And I know that this is kind of a dense slide, and I'm happy to show my presentation. You'll have a recording afterwards. But basically, this one study, a lab study by Wade, when they administered 2.28 milligrams per larvae to honeybee 4-day-old larvae, basically 88% of the larvae died consuming that. Control had 22% mortality. So this is a significant difference, a pretty big one. I can't translate this directly into parts per billion, unfortunately, so I don't know how this compares. Like, if a bumblebee picked up a diflubanzuron contaminated pollen, like how much would end up in an average brood cell? But this is one data point. Kegley et al., and I think some of you participated in this study, looked at 60 colonies over a year, measured the colony health and the hive pollen pesticides. And basically, there was increasingly poor outcomes as the hive pollen concentrations of neonics plus diflubenzuron in combination increased. And those concentrations over the time period of the study, over all the 60 colonies, ranged from 0 to 717 parts per billion, which is higher than what we see in, but not all. So anyway, you guys know the study, or Steve, I think you do anyway, but how all those, numbers were sort of like normalized. But anyway, that's another data point that when neonics and diflubenzuron are together, you might have worse outcomes based upon the results of the study. There was a study by Thompson. She treated at 214 milligrams per brood cell, which seems quite a bit higher than this Wade study up here. She did not have, I think, quite as significant, but the study showed that there were significantly higher egg removals and replacements compared to controls, also significantly higher brood replacement up to 6 weeks after the treatment, and a short-term reduction in the number of adult bees. So this is, kind of a number of different sort of effects here. Again, sort of a lot of it based on reproduction, which is what you would expect with diflubenzuron. And then, but we're also seeing, like in this last study and a little bit in her study, some effects on adults, like the number of adults, which you might expect because that's sort of a reproductive outcome. But let's see at the bottom, looking at 167 parts per billion, which is less than the aphis residue immediately afterwards, they had lower adult survival relative to controls. So basically, we have a number of studies that show that diflubenzuron is certainly not good for bees. Concentration dependent, probably, but these are sort of data points for you to think about. And then just briefly, and I won't go over the details in this, but essentially, there have been field studies by a number of other authors that have looked at insect abundance changes, looking at a bunch of different taxa, everything from, flying predators and parasitoids, beetles, and generally speaking, reductions short-term, and in some cases, in one case, even up to a year later, they were measuring reduced abundance. As you can imagine, it's very difficult to collect this kind of data and to analyze it because there's so much variability. But again, I'm kind of just giving you a lot of data points. Like basically, there's, I think, enough studies showing that we've got some certainly short-term concerns about this chemical and possibly long-term. So one thing I wanted to share with you, you may know this already, but grasshoppers, they don't all eat forbs. Some of them really specialize on grasses, but some of them are more generalist, or they eat forbs and grasses. Some of them only eat forbs, but most of the worst ones, essentially, that are highlighted in yellow here, these are the ones that cause 90% of the damage, according to a study by Dockel. And so these are the ones that eat forbs that are more likely to be competitive for bee forage. If you're out in an area and you're hearing about grasshopper outbreaks, you want to know which species they're finding in high numbers, because if it's any of these species and none of these species, you really probably don't have to worry that they're going to compete with your forage. You should be more worried about the pesticide spray. But if it's these species, you might have impacts on your forage. basically these melanoplus species, and especially the ones that are highlighted. So again, I'm just showing the QR code for what is your experience. And I want to just share how, if you are concerned about this, how you can make your voices heard. Essentially, we are promoting, and especially for public lands, that the APHIS embrace better transparency and advanced notification because it's pretty awful right now. We also really would like to see watersheds better protected. Although there are buffers along seasonal and permanent waterways, there's nothing along waterways that dry up, even though parts of the West get seasonal rain in the summertime. And there may be, if excuse me, ephemeral water, a lot of, waterways that don't run water year round. But given the persistence of some of these chemicals that can end up in the watershed, and diflubenzuron is pretty toxic to bivalves, so we have concerns about that. Especially on public lands, we'd like to see more protection of sensitive species and places. And then really this one is probably like the most relevant to you, but we would like to see, the government work with universities and work with stakeholders to shift toward management practices that are more sustainable to help rangelands be more resilient to grasshopper populations. And although I'm not going to present data and practices here, there are a number of studies that show that these are not just completely pie in the sky, that there, are ways that have been demonstrated, at least in scientific studies, that can help to manage rangeland. A couple of upcoming opportunities. I'm working on well, I call it a conservation letter. It's a letter that I'm seeking sign-ons for. That will be coming later this month. So I would ask you to consider signing on. We brought a lawsuit against APHIS a couple of years ago. We won that lawsuit. Basically, the lawsuit, the remedies just came out this summer, and APHIS has to redo its environmental impact statement. So this letter is going to be focusing on essentially what's next, how we want to remain involved, what we would like to see that ES include for alternatives. And it should broaden the range of alternatives and the purpose and the need. But I am concerned that it will be lipstick on a pig. I want to see that this is real, but it's going to take, I think, public involvement to make sure that APHIS makes good on this. A couple of examples of like when we work with the federal government on this, BLM manages most of the land that is public land that is sprayed. And BLM has some power here. They can decide whether to request a spray or not. They can also put stipulations and limits on spray. They have their own internal processes and stuff. So we can ask for areas off limits. We can ask for more transparency directly from BLM. We can ask them to focus treatments in certain ways. There's some great examples of states that are already doing this. Nevada and Idaho are actually the best so far. And we can ask for environmental monitoring to be done and for the results of those. So APHIS is not the only agency that we can work through, but these are ways we can maybe exert a little bit of leverage. So real quick, because I want to have time for discussion, but I wanted to share with you a new guide that our pollinator team just came out with that focuses on rangeland wildflowers and their nutritional value for livestock. We already know that these flowers are really important for pollinators. But for livestock, there's many parts of the Central Plains in particular where private landowners spray out their forbs. And so, they just herbicide with, broadleaf herbicides and try to make it a fully grass habitat. But the reality is that these are all flowers. You probably can't read the names, but these are all different species of forbs. And basically, if you look at what a 1,200-pound lactating cow needs for crude protein, it's this line right here. Well, 75% of the forb species that are on this list, which I believe is a cross section across the plains, are actually contain more than enough protein individually to meet, I shouldn't say individually, but that the plant species contains enough to meet the needs for a lactating cow if they consume it. So they're in line with, or they even exceed that of grass hay. And similarly, when you look at total digestible nutrients, which is kind of similar to calories, but it really takes into account like all the nutrients from carbohydrates, lipids, proteins all together, there's a certain minimum requirement again for a lactating cow, which is here. And here we've got 93% of the species that are at or above the minimum requirements for a cow. So essentially, that what the species shows is that there's no need to spray out forbs. It's not, these are not detrimental to your cattle. They actually contribute as much as grass hay. So for you all as beekeepers, I wanted to give you access to this information so that as put your hives out on private rangeland, you can convey this message to the landowners that you're working with. So I just want to say thanks to everybody who supports Xerces, a bunch of different organizations and foundations, and feel free to become a member. And so, yeah, just wanted to open it up for discussion. And I can stop sharing if that makes it easier. I can always come back if people wanted to review a slide.
Thank you so much, Sharon. That was great. If folks are interested in asking some questions or having a discussion, feel free to just unmute yourself. You can also put questions in the chat, and if you do that, then I can read those for the group.
It's some super interesting work. I was kind of surprised by the dates on most of the difluorobenzoate or whatever it is research, and it just seems like there was like a 15 to 20-year gap, and then we started picking up on some research again. Any idea why it was like the initial research at registration and then everything was on registration review, or what happened in that 20-year period?
For diflubenzuron in
Yeah,
particular?
yeah.
I think you're right. I think a lot of that initial research probably happened, when they were looking at it and it got registered. And yeah, more recently, there had been, I think, this focus on insect growth regulators that was spurred by bee die-offs in the almond orchards, like back in the early, like 2010s. And there seemed to be some focus then on insect growth regulators as a group, and diflubenzuron began. But some researchers too, I noticed like some names have popped up where they've looked repeatedly at certain kinds of groups of chemicals, like these MOMART studies. Um, and so, yeah, that's my explanation. I don't know if it's right, but I think that, you see that sometimes in science, like the grasshopper stuff is the same way. There was a huge, like, cooperative effort that APHIS and a bunch of universities and the federal government basically funded all this research on grasshoppers and trying to look for more sustainable solutions back in the 80s and 90s. And then all that funding eventually sort of expired, and grasshopper research just went like this. And so, yeah, I think that happens in research, like things ebb and flow depending upon funding and issues and all that.
Thank you.
Yeah. So, Steve, I see your question. Was there any evidence of public subsidy for private grasshopper control programs? Yes. The Oregon subsidy. Well, first of all, let me say that the APHIS program itself is heavily subsidized. So it's 100% free for when the sprays occur on BLM lands, like BLM doesn't pay the cost, or if any federal lands. It's also free for all tribal lands, so all the cost is borne, elsewhere in the federal government, APHIS's budget, Department of Interior budget at a higher level. But when it comes to states, they get a 50% subsidy. And when it comes to private landowners, they get a 1/3 subsidy. So they have to pay 2/3 of the cost, but 1/3 of the cost is subsidized for private lands. Now, when it comes to the state-run programs like Oregon's program, they completely underwrote and reimbursed landowners for sprays on their private land in 2022 and 2023. They basically had $5 million that they got the legislature to approve. And when that money ran out, it ran out. But otherwise, it's like money was being handed out. The other one that I know about for sure that happens annually is in Idaho. In Idaho, the state Department of Ag basically provides carbaryl bait to any landowner that asks until essentially they run out. And at one point, I think I tried to map or list out the different counties where that was happening because they used to actually be a little bit more transparent in Idaho about that. And they would do these end of year reports saying we handed out, 850,000 pounds of carbaryl bait in Ada County, blah, blah, blah. And, but I haven't seen in the last couple of years, like more spatial data associated with that. Like, I know that that program still exists, but so there is different subsidy at different levels. I think the counties too, through the weed and pest districts, probably provide some subsidies in different states, but I just don't know a whole lot about that. So,
I noticed on one of your slides that you had Nosema on there. And
yes.
that product, that Nolo bait, which was Nosema locusta, I understand that that plant burnt down, but it was a targeted pesticide instead of a broad spectrum. What's going on with that now? Do you know? It's not available for you know, at the garden center level anymore.
Yeah, I heard the same thing that that plant burned down and so I'm not as familiar with sort of like the way it works, so I can't really speak very intelligently to it right now. But I know that as a basically biological, I mean, it's been so long since I've looked into it that I can't really speak very intelligently about it, but it's possible that it could have some, broader toxicity. It's not a grasshopper specific, but, and I wouldn't be surprised if it would come back online because it seemed like Extension was recommending it, especially for home gardens and small acreages. And people who just didn't want to use essentially, a synthetic pesticide. So yeah, that I wish I knew more. I can look into it a little bit more if you like.
Well, I used to use it, okay?
Okay. Uh-huh.
And it was essentially like mixed in with a grasshopper food, grass seed or something of that nature. And you just sprinkle it around on the ground, and as they ate it, it would give them this nosema, which is that particular one is this Nosema locusta. I mean, bees, we have Nosema, but it's a different type of Nosema apis, and what's the other one? Nosema. There's another Nosema, but nonetheless, it's a I don't even know if it's a bacteria or virus or what on earth it is, but the bottom line is that it did seem to be a targeted biocide. And it would be really great to have something like that available for large scale management, but maybe nobody's tested the efficacy of it on large scale management. I mean, because it certainly doesn't seem like when you're throwing it out by hand that you're having a lot of control over how much gets deposited where. And I could see where that would be a concern on a large scale type program, but it sure was a product that I felt, and I don't run nearly as many colonies as Steve, but I run a couple hundred colonies, and I certainly felt, no qualms whatsoever about putting that out in bad grasshopper years.
Yeah. There was I don't know why I'm forgetting his name. Been thinking about it the last couple of days of forgetting his name, but a Canadian researcher who worked hard to try to advance like a biological control, and went through, a lot of work trying to get it registered. I think I'm trying to remember if it was a Nosema product or if it was something else. It didn't end up getting widely adopted by the sort of like large overarching programs in Canada or the US. And I think the main issue was that um, some of those products are more vulnerable to sort of environmental conditions, like if there's cold or if there happens to be a rain, that they're not as effective. I can't quite remember what it was in particular about this, but there are some of the choices that are made, I think, about which chemicals to include in a control program, can be influenced by some of these efficacy questions. And I think that that was one of them. But it may have been I can't remember if it was a nosema or something else.
Sharon, Scott has his hand up as a question next.
Okay.
Go
Thanks,
ahead.
Sharon, for the presentation. Really informative. One question is, Xerces done any studies or know of any studies that have been done that look at these pesticides that have been sprayed on Western BLM lands and see if residue ends up in the honey?
That's a really good question. We have not done those studies. But based upon that Cagley study that found diflubenzuron at some pretty high levels in, I think they were yew hives, Steve, that I wouldn't be surprised, I mean, now they were testing hive pollen, but I don't know of anyone who has tested the honey. Would you be able to, I mean, do you all know of beekeepers who exclusively run their bees on BLM land?
I don't know. I'm gonna defer a little bit to Steve on this, but I do not believe that there's any public land that is available to commercial beekeepers as
Oh,
as quote unquote grazing rights for bees. And I know that there was some effort by one of the other members of PSC to try and get uh, access, like a grazing right to certain areas that had, good floral resources or whatever, that was flatly denied. And there is, in my opinion, some very good reasons for that. But maybe Steve can chime in and let me know if BLM allows any commercial beekeepers at all on BLM land. Radio silence, maybe not.
I kind of think it's on a case by case basis and area and policy. I don't think it's a flat out. I think there are some cases where it occurs. I think I've had bees on Forest Service land, and it kind of goes by the region and the officers in the area and the direction of whether or not they want to allow it or not. It's kind of on the whim of the bureaucrats has been my experience, Beth. Um, more than a strict policy, and some have kind of long-standing agreements with some of these. There's so much public land in the West. I think I'd have to ask a few more questions about it, but I have put bees out on Forest Service land before, and
Right, and I have heard that as well, because almost all the Western Slope early season production is up into Forest Service land, in the mountains, taking advantage of the wildflower blooms. And so, but BLM is dwarfs Forest Service land.
So Sharon, it seems to me that which you already know, but that would provide a little tougher hook for Xerces, since the requirements usually under FDA, USDA are a little more stringent than they do. If you could show that that's ending up in honey, even anecdotally, even if it's not directly on that and it affects other areas, which I'm sure that it does to some degree.
yeah. It's a chemical that has a low risk profile for people because it's an insect growth regulator. That's not to say it doesn't have any risk. It's there is some risk of in when it's inhaled. Um, and some of the other chemicals like carbaryl, that's actually considered a human carcinogen, a likely human carcinogen by EPA. Um, but I don't know if honey, in terms of like from the human health angle, would show us that we've got a problem because I would imagine the maximum residue limits that they set on certain foods would be high enough that we probably wouldn't exceed those, you know? Um, but I like the idea. And it may, be that if honey was produced from areas where diflubenzuron is used at higher rates, that it actually could. But yeah, that's an interesting question. Yeah.
Well, for organic production, for instance, you have to certify all use in a 2-mile radius around your beehive that there's
Mhm.
no chemical use, whether that be agriculture or control programs of a state or whatever. And
Uh-huh.
and the problem with that is use is not always fully disclosed. So
Right.
even trying to find that out is very difficult. But there's very few spots in the United States where you can plunk a beehive down and take a 2-mile radius and say there's zero chemical exposure. Increasingly, even in these national monuments and national parks and BLM lands that we consider wild and pristine, there's exposures there. So, I
There
mean,
are.
to answer the question of where you can produce certified organic honey in the United States is actually an extremely challenging question. There's very few areas.
That's, yeah, I think really important to know. And one of the questions on the survey is about notification, because notification is not required under APHIS's operating guidelines. It says that they will notify like registered beekeepers. But wait, excuse me, because it says in the operating guidelines that they will notify registered beekeepers, but a buffer is not required. So a notification may occur, but there's no guarantee that they're going to buffer your hives if they know you're out there. So this is anyway something to think
Mm.
about if you're in proximity to some of these areas that tend to get sprayed heavily. Um, and again, something to ask for, I think, because I think that they could strengthen um, their procedures in a way that would be more protective for beekeepers. Um, yeah.
So does it operate a little bit, this grasshopper control program operate a little bit like a public health emergency with a encephalitis and mosquito spraying, that they actually can supersede laws that are on the books and violate laws that are on the books, like do not apply to blooming crops or weeds. That's okay if we have to control a grasshopper outbreak.
That's a good.
Or are regular laws superseded by grasshopper and Mormon control programs? Like label law?
Um, I think that's such a great question. And I think that that is a really good analogy. When I don't, I wouldn't say that regular laws are superseded, but the way that APHIS is authorizing legislation works, it's the Plant Protection Act. And the idea of an emergency is sort of embedded in it. And as long as they've got permission from the landowner, they can spray wherever they want. They do observe an economic threshold, but that economic threshold, the survey activity that supports it because they do these huge spray areas, the survey activity is sort of like weak at best, especially because they don't actually do much sampling for species. But in any case, I'm getting into details. So I think the idea of it being an emergency is sort of part and parcel of the program. That doesn't necessarily mean that they override other laws, but it's things might get shortcutted in a certain way. You know, they still have to, do the Endangered Species Act compliance. But especially with the new NEPA regulations, and I don't know if you guys are following this with what's happening on federal lands with the National Environmental Policy Act, they're kind of very much narrowing the scope of review and notification under NEPA. This is a new initiative by this administration that is probably going to make it less likely that we'll have some of the protections that we even had in the past or the analysis of risk that we had in the past. But again, this would all be legal because it would be, under regulation for this program.
Did you find any records of complaints from beekeepers for bee kills related to the treatment programs? And were there any payments that you came across made, or did they try to get out of any financial responsibilities?
That's a really good question. We did a series of FOIA requests and didn't uncover that. But what we did uncover was drift that was documented in the state of Nevada at more than 1,000 feet, which wasn't really a surprise when you look at the drift modeling that's available. Like, yeah, this is gonna drift 1,000 feet and beyond. But there was only one incident that we actually found in the records that was documented by a state investigator in Nevada. That state investigator noted that basically the buffer that's utilized by APHIS is 500 feet. And the state investigator recommended that APHIS consider a quarter-mile buffer for private properties and for, other sensitive resources. And in some cases, we do have buffers that wide for certain quite sensitive listed species, but for aquatics, for private properties, it's only 500 feet. And in some cases, like on the sides of roads, and there's like 50 foot or 20 foot, like somebody traveling along the road could easily be oversprayed. So the buffers that APHIS uses, I think, are inadequate in most cases. But I haven't seen records of an actual beekeeper complaint or an incident right up. Yeah. I will say that sometimes the records that we got back from the FOIA requests were very sparse. Different state offices chose to provide the level of detail that they wanted to provide, and some states were very, they gave us everything, it seemed. Other states gave us practically nothing, even though we knew there was a ton of spray activity. That was the case with Montana in particular. We got almost nothing from Montana. And when I say Montana, I mean the APHIS office located in Montana. Yeah.
And where did Wyoming fall on that spectrum?
Wyoming?
Yeah.
Not very good. Not very good.
Shocking.